determine whether the territory gains independence from Indonesia. The head of the United Nations mission, Ian Martin, said people were very determined to exercise their choice despite violence and threats from pro-Indonesian militias during the registration process. Nearly 500,000 people are eligible to vote. If the East Timorese reject autonomy and begin the move towards full independence, it will mark the beginning of the end of 4 centuries of colonisation, first by Portugal, then by Indonesia. East Timor lies at the far eastern edge of the sprawling Indonesian archipelago. It is around 1,000 kilometres from Java and nearly 500 kilometres north of Australia. Portugal ruled East Timor from the 16th century, but in early 1974 Lisbon began decolonisation, with the 2 main Timorese political parties agreeing to independence, but the parties later fell out. In December 1975, the Indonesian army invaded. The following year, Indonesia named East Timor as its 27th province. This has never been recognised by the United Nations. Since the invasion, it is estimated 200,000 people have been killed by the resulting warfare or famine. One of the worst single incidents came in 1991 when Indonesian troops fired on protesters in the capital Dili, killing 200 people. The following year, Janano Gusmao, leader of the East Timorese resistance, was captured and imprisoned. In 1996 came a heightening of international awareness of East Timor when Bishop Belo and José Ramos Horta were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. After receiving the award, both men demanded a referendum on autonomy for the region. This was ignored by President Suharto. But when he was forced from power last year, his successor as president, B.J. Habibie, agreed to a vote on autonomy or full independence from Indonesia should autonomy be rejected. Our correspondent Jonathan Head now reports from Dili on the start of the voting.
At first light, they were already on their way to the polls. The early morning quiet was broken only by the shuffling of feet and the quiet chatter of people about to decide their country's future. Even before voting had started, large crowds gathered outside the polling stations. UN security staff struggled to control the numbers entering the compound. At times, the enthusiasm to vote threatened to overwhelm them. Whole communities had come to cast their ballots. Every generation is taking part in this historic referendum. They clutched their identity documents, ready to be checked by the UN. It was a long wait in the morning sun, but no one seemed to mind. Most of the people here said they would choose independence, a pattern which is expected to be repeated across East Timor. But the head of the UN mission pleaded for tolerance from both sides.
The international community expects all concerned to accept the outcome of the popular consultation and to continue and intensify efforts for reconciliation so as to build a peaceful future for East Timor.
That may be too much to expect after the suffering of the past 24 years. But at least here at the polling stations, for a moment they seem to have escaped the long shadow of East Timor's tragic past.
This area of Dili has experienced some of the worst militia violence. The people admit to being afraid of further attacks. The fact that so many have turned up so early in the day is an enormously encouraging start for the United Nations after the difficulties of the past few weeks. Jonathan Head, BBC News, Dili, East Timor.
And Jonathan says so far on polling day there have been few signs of trouble.
Not so far, but of course the biggest concern I think is in some areas to the west of the territory where the militias have been particularly active. It may be some hours before we get an accurate assessment of what may have happened there. I think for the UN what's of concern is not just the possibility of violence, but also the possibility that large numbers of people who've been pushed out of their homes will not be able to make it to the polling stations, or perhaps people may be blocked on the roads. And I think they will look at the turnout very closely. Early signs, of course, are encouraging here, but the total turnout towards the end of the day will tell them whether this referendum has been a success or whether the militias have succeeded in their campaign to block people from voting.
Jonathan, voting is going to continue all day, as you said. When can we expect a result?
It'll take some time. We expect one within about a week, perhaps a little earlier. The other problem for the UN at the moment is that voting is going quite slowly. Some of the people don't fully understand the procedures and a lot of documents have to be checked. And they expect that in some areas they may have to take voting into a second day to make sure that everybody gets their opportunity to cast their ballot.
Jonathan Head there in Dili in East Timor. The Israelis and the Palestinians have held several hours of talks in Jerusalem to try to resolve their differences over the stalled peace process, but there is no sign of any breakthrough. Reports say the two sides might meet again during the next few hours. Despite disagreements on several issues, including the release of Palestinian prisoners, the Israeli Prime Minister says he's hopeful a peace agreement can be signed with the Palestinians this week.
Time is running out for the Palestinian and Israeli negotiators to come to an agreement over how and when to implement the Y peace accord. Prime Minister Ehud Barak's office has issued a statement warning that the government will implement the agreement unilaterally if an agreement is not reached over its implementation. The talks are stalled on two major issues. First, the question of prisoner releases. The Y Accord calls for the release of 750 Palestinian prisoners. The Palestinians want these to be political prisoners, but the Israelis insist that they'll not release anyone who, as they put it, has blood on their hands. The second major issue is the timetable for Israeli troop withdrawals from the West Bank. There's talk of a tentative agreement that the withdrawals should be carried out by January next year, but the Palestinians had wanted a commitment to finalising the land handovers at an earlier date. On Sunday morning, Ehud Barak said he hoped that a deal could be reached on all these issues in the next few days. US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright starts her Middle Eastern tour this week, and there are still hopes that she'll preside over an agreement and that this could pave the way for the beginning of talks on the difficult final status issues, which include the future of Jerusalem and the question of final borders. There's enormous pressure now for a deal to be reached on the implementation of the Y Accord, even though the differences between the two sides are still significant. Hilary Anderson, BBC News, Jerusalem.
Israel's Supreme Court has rejected an appeal by the convicted killer of the former Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and instead extended by 3 years the jail term he was given for conspiracy. The court accepted a prosecution plea to toughen the sentences passed on Yigal Amir and his brother Haggai in 1996. The appeal stemmed from a conspiracy trial which was separate from other proceedings in which Yigal Amir was sentenced to life imprisonment for the killing of Mr Rabin in November 1995. Northern Ireland's leading unionist politician has cast doubt over the potential for reviving the ailing peace process. David Trimble said the prospects for peace were slim after the IRA issued death threats against a number of Roman Catholic teenagers. The events follow a ruling by the British Northern Ireland Secretary Mo Mowlam that the IRA had not breached its ceasefire.
A housing estate in the town of Dungannon in County Tyrone in Northern Ireland. 4 teenagers are now in hiding in London after fleeing this area. The parents of 2 of the expelled boys say they're being blamed unfairly for crime on their estate and don't deserve a death sentence.
They might have been in mobby fighting or, doing it wee, ordinary things, but not trouble what people are saying they were in now. Now, the ones saying they were into drugs, which is a lie, they don't. Into joyriding, which is another thing because they too can drive, so they can't be joyriding.
Added to this, a 15-year-old youth from Belfast was on Monday night given 48 hours to leave the province by the paramilitary Irish Republican Army or face the death penalty. The murder of a Catholic taxi driver last month with alleged IRA involvement and a gun-running operation from the United States has led to pressure on the British government to say whether it thought the IRA ceasefire declared in 1997 to help nationalist Sinn Féin still held. Britain's Northern Ireland Secretary Mo Mowlam has ruled that the IRA's ceasefire is intact, and that's been met with a furious reaction from Northern Ireland's unionist politicians, among them the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, David Trimble.
Fortunately, the Secretary of State evaded the issue, I'm sorry to say, and consequently the IRA now feel that they can be even bolder in their breaches of the ceasefire. And I think a mistake has been made, and we now have to consider how we recover from that mistake.
The question of what exactly is a ceasefire is now centre stage in Northern Ireland politics. It's one more problem that will face the former US Senator George Mitchell, who helped mediate last year's Good Friday peace deal. He's due to return in September as chairman of a review of the peace process. Lindsay Marnock, BBC News.
The authorities in Burundi say ethnic Hutu rebels have attacked the capital Bujumbura, killing more than 20 civilians, many of them children. The Burundian defence minister said that 20 rebels were also killed in the fighting when the attackers moved into 2 suburbs on Saturday night. A spokesman for the main rebel faction has denied that the rebels killed the civilians and has blamed the army. The rebels are now reported to have withdrawn, taking several hostages with them. The death toll in the Turkish earthquake is now reported to have reached nearly 14,000. However, officials and aid workers believe it is likely to be triple that figure, as tens of thousands remain unaccounted for. Turkey's government estimates the cost of damage is as much as £6.25 billion, and as many as 600,000 remain homeless after the quake hit almost 2 weeks ago. Gale force winds have swept through a suburb in the South African city of Cape Town, killing several people. The winds devastated the suburb of Manenberg, leaving at least 100 injured.
The severe storm lashed Cape Town in the early hours of the morning. Emergency services have been ferrying the injured to hospitals and helping those most affected by the storm. For much of the day, people have been returning to their homes to salvage furniture and clothing. While some searched for whatever possessions they could find, others dug deep into the debris to retrieve their terrified pets.
When the storm was over, we ran outside our houses, we heard people screaming, and we saw this chaos here.
Whilst it's a miracle that more people weren't killed in this violent storm, thousands have been left homeless and traumatized by the experience.
Because it was horrible. This is a horrible experience that I've got for the first time in my life. And I thank God that I'm still here on my feet.
Many of these streets are littered with roof sheeting and debris, and electricity lines are down. Hundreds of people are still milling around the streets waiting for help from the already stretched rescue team.
Hundreds of homes and thousands of people are now obviously without a roof over their head, and I think that's the next problem to sort out, is to try and find temporary housing, to accommodate everybody. Clearly, security is now a problem. People won't leave their homes until there's security to secure all their possessions and that sort of thing.
With the prospect of nightfall and more rains ahead, the town councils now face the task of securing the devastated homes to prevent looting. And even more pressing is the need to provide temporary housing to the thousands of homeless people. Geraldine Farley, BBC News, Cape Town.
The head of the UN mission in Kosovo, Bernard Kouchner, has vigorously defended the UN's work in the province. It follows criticism from the Yugoslav government that the mission has been slow and inept. Mr. Kouchner was speaking during a break in talks with the new American ambassador to the UN, Richard Holbrooke, who's on a 3-day visit to the province. Mr. Holbrooke defended the peacekeeping operation and emphasised the enormous task facing the UN mission.
As the Americans' new man at the United Nations, Richard Holbrooke is no stranger to the old problems of the Balkans. He's come to Kosovo to learn for himself why a political settlement between Albanians and Serbs is proving so difficult to achieve. Orthodox church leaders told him Serbs favoured Swiss-style cantons to keep them secure.
Pokrenuto je pitanje kantonizacije, u stvari u cilju zaštite.
The important issue we had was the cantonization that we were thinking about, the security of the Serbs that are blocked in some cities. We talked about that quite a lot, and about their security, and now it's some elements of this question that need to be seen to and to be done.
But taking his cue from the international community's fear of sectioning off Kosovo, Ambassador Holbrooke spelled out his resistance to any form of political fragmentation.
That's the United States doesn't support that. But the other point they made was about the destruction of some of the religious sites, and that is very serious.
The theme of Mr. Holbrooke's 3-day visit to Kosovo is law and order. The commander of the international peacekeepers here briefed him on a number of outstanding security issues. After that, it was talks with Albania's political leadership, who made it clear what they wanted for future progress in Kosovo.
We both agreed
that the situation is improving relatively well.
We see progress and problems both here. It's a very difficult situation, but at least now we are in a free Pristina, free of intimidation.
2.5 months after peacekeepers moved into Kosovo, Richard Holbrooke will have learned that the ending of the war has not meant a flourishing of the peace. Whilst he brings an understanding of the issues to the region, he's unlikely to be taking away any easy solutions. Duncan Kennedy, BBC News in Kosovo.
You're watching BBC News. A reminder of the headlines. There's been a big turnout at polling stations in East Timor as local people decide the future of the former Portuguese colony. So far, there have been no reports of renewed violence. And Israel's Prime Minister says a peace agreement with the Palestinians could be signed this week. Those are the main headlines this hour. Still to come, bringing home the bacon, how international peacekeepers in Kosovo have become the middlemen in an unusual deal between the province's Serbs and Albanians. The president of the former Soviet Republic of Kyrgyzstan has made a nationwide appeal for calm as his government struggles to deal with hundreds of Islamic militants in a remote southern region of the country. The rebels have now released 4 of the 17 hostages they seized. 4 Japanese geologists are among those still being held.
The government's pledged to do everything in its power to clamp down on the rebels. The seizing of the hostages 8 days ago has been the worst crisis to hit this normally peaceful mountain nation since its independence from the former Soviet Union. Hundreds of militants are now spread across the high mountains of southern Kyrgyzstan, sending 4,000 refugees fleeing from their homes. A group calling itself the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan has said it's behind the incursion into Kyrgyzstan. Its aim, it says, is a holy war against the secular leaders of the neighbouring powerful Muslim state of Uzbekistan. Kyrgyzstan's Central Asian neighbours Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan have pledged their support. Russia too has promised weapons, but at the moment Kyrgyzstan is struggling alone, with a crisis that could yet spread across Central Asia's poorest borders. In the remote south, weapons are being handed out to men with military experience to bolster the country's fragile defences. Alice Coulter, BBC News.
The president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, has accused Congress of trying to prevent him from performing his duties. The Constitutional Assembly, which is controlled by supporters of the president, is due to meet on Monday to discuss a proposal to assume the remaining functions of Congress. The Assembly has also been given the task of rewriting the country's constitution.
Political tensions have been high in Venezuela since the Constitutional Assembly was elected on July the 25th. Filled with supporters of President Hugo Chavez, it declared itself the country's supreme power and stripped the Congress of most of its functions. At a special session of the Assembly, the Secretary read a decree suspending the activities of Congress.
El no cumplimiento de esas funciones.
Opponents of the move have accused the president, himself the leader of a failed coup attempt, of trampling on democratic rules and leading the country towards dictatorship. But Chavez, who is very popular among Venezuela's 23 million people, says the shake-up of government institutions is needed to end decades of corruption and mismanagement. Keith Miller, BBC News.
We return now to our top story, the historic independence referendum in East Timor. The leader of the pro-Indonesian militia blamed for much of the violence in the run-up to the vote, Eurico Guterres, said his forces would respect the outcome of the poll. He was speaking to reporters at the station in Dili where he cast his vote. He said he'd come to vote not as a militia leader, but as an East Timorese who wanted to decide his province's future. Also voting at the same station was the Nobel Peace Prize winner, Bishop Carlos Bello. He'd urged voters to turn out despite threats of militia violence in a sermon read out in all East Timorese churches on Sunday. Within a few hours of the polls opening, 50% of those registered to vote had done so. The Brazilian Congress is considering a controversial bill to outlaw the private ownership of guns. The government's proposal follows a sharp rise in violent crime. There were almost 30,000 murders in Brazil last year, the overwhelming majority committed with firearms.
Antonio Carlos and Susana Garcia are a middle-class couple who live in Sao Paulo. He is a lawyer, she is an architect, and they both have plenty of leisure interests. One of those interests is guns. The Garcias own a pistol and a revolver, both legally licensed.
Uma vez à noite, andando de carro, num farol.
Once I stopped at a traffic light and I saw a taxi driver being robbed at knife point by 2 youngsters. So I got out my pistol, cocked it, shouted at the boys, and they ran away.
The Garcias see themselves as responsible gun users. They practice regularly and regard the right to own firearms as absolutely basic. Under new government proposals, they would have to hand in their weapons. The government is reacting to a wave of violence in the poor districts of Brazil's cities. In the Sao Paulo metropolitan region, about 8,000 people are murdered every year, often in drug-related incidents. There are many multiple killings, like the one which took place in this bar. On the night of the 12th of June, 7 people, including the owner, were drinking in this bar. At midnight, 5 armed men burst in. All 7 people here were shot dead. The bar has been left exactly as it was that night, and it's a very sad scene. We have beer bottles here on the table, a game of cards unfinished on the counter, and here a hole in the fridge where one of the bullets went in. This is the latest in a series of crimes which have shocked Sao Paulo. The police have been unable to stem the tide of violence. Most officers seem to be broadly in favour of banning gun ownership by private citizens.
A princípio, eu sou favorável. Eu acho que somente polícia é que deveria.
In principle, I support the law. I think that only the police should be allowed to carry arms. But given the current situation in Brazil, that's not possible yet. And I think the new law could be improved.
The government's plans have come under attack from Brazil's powerful arms industry. Taurus, the largest producer, supplies the United States with more than 20% of its handguns. The gun lobby says most of the weapons circulating in Brazil are illegal, and the best thing would be to enforce existing controls. Even if the new law is passed by Congress, many experts doubt whether it will be an effective way of dealing with the violence in Brazilian cities. Unemployment, drugs, and the inefficiency of the police may lie nearer the heart of the problem. In areas like this, the climate of fear is likely to continue. Stephen Sleech, BBC News, Sao Paulo.
French hypermarket chains Carrefour and Promode are planning a merger to create the world's second largest retail group. Carrefour is France's largest supermarket group, selling everything from food to computers in its hypermarkets. Together, the combined group would have sales of $50 billion. The move comes just weeks after America's largest chain, Walmart, increased its presence in Europe with the purchase of Britain's Asda. Here in Britain, prayers have been said for Diana, Princess of Wales, at a church service for members of the royal family at the Queen's Balmoral estate in Scotland. Among the royal family at the service were the Queen, Prince Charles and the Queen Mother. Princes William and Harry also attended the private prayers for their mother. Tuesday is the 2nd anniversary of the princess's death. Princess Diana's former lover, James Hewitt, is planning to publish his memoirs, but he says it will not include any extracts from her love letters to him. The former British cavalry officer has been accused of betraying the princess by exposing details of the letters sent to him 10 years ago. But his lawyer insists that although the autobiography would include details of his relationship with Diana, the contents of her letters will remain private. The book is due out early next year. One of the dividends of peace in Kosovo, it seems, is pink, has 4 legs and squeals. British troops serving with the peacekeeping force KFOR have negotiated the successful return of Serbian pigs in exchange for Albanian tractors, in what can only be described as a new breed of peacemaking.
British KFOR soldiers in the Serbian village of Orlana have called on skills that were never covered in the training manual this weekend. Rounding up stray pigs wandering into an ethnic Albanian village. They managed to bring 7 of the capricious animals to heel after a rigorous struggle, which at times was a bit of a scrum. Although Operation Bring Home the Bacon was a success, another half-dozen or so disappeared into a forest thought to be mined, so still elude their Serbian owners.
This for us is the first step towards calming down the tensions between the two nations. We'll listen to you, and everything you say we will surely obey.
In exchange, 3 tractors which had mysteriously gone astray in the Serbian region were returned to Albanian farmers, establishing a dialogue for peace at a very local and basic level. The exchange, brokered by KFOR's men, is being called the Pigs for Pickups deal, a light-hearted label with a serious agenda.
This, I think, is a bit of a test case in this village. There are many Serbs that live over the border in Serbia who used to live in Orlana, and I think if they see that KFOR has established a safe environment for all Serbs within this area of Kosovo, and also that their property can be returned. We may be able to encourage some of the Serbs to return back to their homes in Kosovo.
The roundup attracted a good deal of attention from creatures great and small. More than one type of animal made friends in the process. As a result of the success of this farmyard diplomacy, other deals involving an exchange of cattle are scheduled in northeastern Kosovo for next week. Virginia Eastman, BBC News.
Well, let's have a look now at what the international newspapers are saying around the world. Starting off with the International Herald Tribune, it's carrying a story about US farmers apparently paid premium prices this spring to sow many of their fields with genetically engineered corn and soybean seed. But now, as the fall harvest nears, more of the international buyers they depend on are saying that they do not want these crops. The Sydney Morning Herald has a story on the Turkish earthquake. When seismologists reviewed data from the devastating earthquake in Turkey, they discovered the force of the quake appeared to have pushed Turkey more than a metre close to Europe. The Asian Age, the makers of Viagra, the anti-impotence pill, are making a biscuit form of the drug for people who find tablets difficult to swallow. Those are the international papers. You're watching BBC News.
Good morning. The day just gone had this front lying across it. Now I'm going to run about 5 days worth of pressure pattern. You watch this high, the Azores high, the thing that brings us summer. It's edging in all the time. It takes a while, goes through the bank holiday before it does very much, and then it springs into action, widens, and by about Thursday we're all in the middle of it. Then it goes east a bit and things change. So that's next weekend, so we're not worried about it. The point is, it's a fairly settled week with a little disruption to start off with. Temperatures aren't nothing to worry about. Suggest a fair amount of cloud, and that'll be correct. Cloud not really bearing rain in the southeast of England, but it is bearing rain in the northwest, in particular the northwest of Scotland. And that rain on the whole will tend to diffuse as it heads southwards, but it will head southwards to at least the northwest of England and Northern Ireland. There's the morning position, for example. By lunchtime, some of Scotland will come out in the bright weather again. Some breaks in the cloud will allow a bit of sunshine. But the rain, although falling less heavily, will be still steadily falling in some places, Glasgow and Belfast probably. During the afternoon, though, these places should dry up. But I still think if you're windward, and that basically means the Lake District, it's going to be a damp old day. Disappointing. On the lee side of the Pennines and probably south of Snowdonia area, it looks like being fairly dry, possibly bright, but the sunshine is really going to be to the south of that. It won't be quite as warm sunshine as it was. The wind took a little bit of a turn to the west. We had a cold front go through, the one that's now over us, so we'll need to knock a couple of degrees off. For the areas without a great deal of wind, it means there'll still be a sea breeze to cool the coast down, but we're down to 21 and 22 anyway. Still into the 70s, but only just. For northern Britain, with temperatures of 17 or 18 and the same wind, the same cloud as the last few days, it'll feel much the same.
Journalists from around the world give an international perspective on events in the UK. Dateline London, next on BBC News 24.
The first time those running the war against Milosevic tell their story.
In a campaign whose fundamental purpose is to reinforce diplomacy, what you're involved in is high-stakes coercion.
Lifting the veil on the conflict in Kosovo in a Newsnight special, 11:10 today on BBC News 24.
What would happen if the temperature outside suddenly dropped to way below freezing? Or if global warming turned the Earth's surface into barren desert? Changes in climate are already threatening the fate of our planet. Certain evidence suggests the dawn of an ice age, which may engulf the UK at any time. BBC Two lays bare the facts on the life support of our planet. Hot and Cold Night, tonight from 7:30 on BBC Two.
You're watching BBC News 24. I'm Eileen Whelan. The latest news at 4:30. Scotland's farming minister has joined his Welsh counterpart in calling for help for sheep farmers hit by falling prices. Under devolution, the two ministers say they could fund their own schemes, despite the government in London ruling out extra aid. It could lead to the government's first political dilemma caused by devolution. A fifth teenager is reported to have been told to leave Northern Ireland by the IRA, but the RUC has not confirmed this. 4 other young men who were threatened with death unless they left the province are now in hiding in London. The Conservatives and the Ulster Unionists have called on the government to stop the release of paramilitary prisoners. The United Nations said half of East Timor's voters had turned up to vote in the first 4 hours of polling in a referendum which could lead to independence from Indonesia. The BBC correspondent there says that so far the vote is free from violence. Pro-Indonesian groups have been waging a violent campaign to prevent the territory from leaving Indonesian control after more than 20 years. The UN brokered a peace accord between both pro- and anti-independence fighters in a bid to limit violence while the voting takes place. And the biggest street festival in Europe, the Notting Hill Carnival, has enjoyed fine weather on its first day. More than 2 million people are expected at the event that started yesterday and continues later today. And those are the headlines. There'll be a full bulletin on the hour. Next up, it's Dateline London.
Hello. This time, why has Tony Blair's approval rating taken such a dive? We'll also look at the IRA ceasefire decisions, at England's dismal Test cricket performance, and at the disappearance of Diana. With me to talk about all those subjects are Kip Brooke of the New Zealand Press Association, Vijay Dutt of the Hindustan Times, Mariana Landzettel of SWR German Radio, Vladimir Simonov of the Russian press agency Novosti, and Edward Pearce of The Scotsman. Now, Tony Blair's approval rating in a Mori poll for The Times on Thursday slipped to the lowest rating of his leadership. Meanwhile, for the Conservatives, Anne Widdecombe's been making an awfully big showing lately. So what's all this a sign of? Is it midterm blues or what? Edward Pearce?
I think Blair has been vulnerable to something like this happening for quite a while. If the 2 words you ever wanted to use about Blair, they were insubstantial and brittle. And if you aren't substantial and you're relying upon publicity, propaganda, spinning and the rest of it, and you do it too much and you stumble and blunder, as he has done, over Northern Ireland and over his personal affairs, you know, lengths of the Italian beach being roped off for his personal use and the Bersaglieri being called in to protect Blair's holiday, in a way not your pattern or mine, as it were. I've just come back from North Wales and there wasn't a policeman there to look after the cottage for me. If you behave like that, a lot of people are going to get quite seriously miffed, and your business about being the people's Prime Minister is going to get distinctly dented.
If you say a lot of people are seriously miffed with Blair, they haven't concomitantly said, oh, well, our man is William Hague, because his approval rating has gone down too. In fact, the only people who have benefited a bit have been the Lib Dems and Charles Kennedy.
I think that the Tory party, we mustn't get off onto the Tory party, it's too tempting, it is in a long-term depression, which it's not going to come out of for a long time, because it had what I would call a successful government, which was politically successful, economically successful and politically calamitous. And that is a kind of fixture in everybody's mind, so that they cannot benefit from anybody else getting into trouble. There is a sort of vacuum. Labour floated up. As soon as Labour gets into trouble, there is no natural heir. Liberals pick up a bit. And Blair himself has been a one-man band, and foolishly, instead of saying, right, very nice for me while it lasts, let's spread it around and make the whole thing work, has kept on. There's an article in the paper today written by the appalling Derek Draper, this creature, this runner, this bookie's runner, much better phrase for him, telling us how the civil service are going to be shaken up and the wretched, stuffy old mandarins are going to be swept away by Tony Blair, who knows better. Well, you can get away with that sort of talk at the beginning of things when you're a complete clean slate. If after 2¼ years of very ordinary government, you start talking in that sort of Ozymandian megalomaniac way, or having your spookies runners do it, people are going to get miffed.
OK, well, let's see what the others make of it. Mariana Landzettel, has Tony Blair taken his eye off the ball being away on holiday? What should we make of this poll?
Well, I mean, I must say, I felt very sorry for him when he went on holiday because he had such a tough time beforehand. And I was wondering when I read this, Paul, maybe that also has got something to do with some of the other figures and statistics that have shown up over the summer. I mean, there was, for example, quite a lot of discussion about the housing market and, you know, how the South was so overpopulated and everybody had to move in order to make a living. And I think if you have this kind of statistics coming up and the economy obviously going well still, but it's stretching it a bit at the moment. So if you haven't got anybody home to sort of say anything to give it a spin, then I think the polls might go down.
And
so
isn't the economy being in a good state, Vladimir, one of the problems that William Hague has? And nobody has any particular reason to move to the Conservatives at the moment.
Well, I personally am a big fan of Mr. Blair and a big enthusiast of his. So I don't
no counting for tastes.
Yeah, so I don't pay much attention to those poll results. We know pretty well that in the times of Tory governments, Mrs. Thatcher, Mr. Major also suffered the same sort of midsummer blues. And their fall in ratings were even much worse than we witnessed today. So as far as the economy is in pretty well shape and the party could focus in future on some social matters, I think we'll see the ratings will go up with the by-elections and with the conferences which approach.
Kip Brooke, I sensed you nodding next to me at that.
Well, I just look at Tony Blair and look at all the things that he's gone through in the last year. I mean, he's had to hold Bill Clinton's hand. He's had Kosovo. He's had the Gulf War. He's had all sorts of problems. He's had Northern Ireland. And I just wonder whether the British people feel as though they've been left out in all this.
Interesting, hasn't it, this whole phenomenon of Anne Widdecombe?
I think I agree with him. But what has happened is that Mr. Tony Blair's desire to become a world leader, a world statesman, I think has cost him very heavy. He's left NHS, he's left public service to go into doldrums just because trying to be everything for everything. He did not let his ministers take any initiatives. They are not used to taking initiatives. So he left home, went abroad. He became a peacemaker in Northern Ireland, a great hammer to Mr. Milosevic in Belgrade and NATO. He tried to be a Clinton, but he didn't realize...
Jay, I will interrupt you. Is it so bad? I mean, no, Mr. Blair...
No, he's not so bad. What I'm coming to that. He's not bad. But what I'm trying to say is that you cannot afford to have a presidential type of attitude when you are working in a democracy. Here, he cannot be a Clinton in Britain. That's one point. And the other thing is that Mr. Blair's biggest advantage, which I should say, is that even if his honeymoon is over, there is no third party to crowd his affair with the people. So he's safe from that point of view.
Mariana, Anne Widdecombe, who I keep mentioning, nobody's picked me up yet, but she has made a phenomenal showing over the past couple of weeks for the Tory party. Is she a politician that you would take seriously?
Well, I mean, you always probably have to see it in correspondence with Mr. Hague. And I mean, I think he's been relaunched now for the third time, and even the third relaunch really hasn't amounted to much. So I think almost anybody in the Conservative Party has probably a good chance of being a substitute for Mr. Hague.
Well, you were talking about ministers taking initiatives, and Kip mentioned Northern Ireland. And of course, at the end of the week, Mo Mowlam, the Northern Ireland Secretary of State, did finally make her decision over the IRA ceasefire. A difficult one it was for her, but she decided it was intact. The unionists were furious, and some of them threatened to take her to court. Edward, predictably, a lot of people said that she was crazy to say that the ceasefire was intact, but if she'd said it wasn't intact, the peace process would have been over.
Well, the peace process is over in the sense that there were, in the last 12 months, 134 violent acts by the two sets of paramilitaries in the estates. That's the test, and if it's a peace process that has that much violence, it's failed. And I think it was an act of astonishing weakness. I mean, if she'd said quite openly and cynically, look, we want to keep process open. For that reason, we're going to ignore the crimes. You can defend that, at least in terms of consistency, not morality. But when she says, well, there have been terrible killings, and I have thought seriously about classifying this as the end of ceasefire, but I've changed my mind and I decided to let it through. It's like saying to a child, Johnny, I was thinking quite hard about smacking you, but I'm not going to smack you. But remember, I thought quite hard about it. It is a public demonstration of weakness. Now, her weakness or Mr. Blair's weakness? The great international statesman has there the great boost for his ego, the Good Friday Agreement. He wants it for its own sake. Behind the facade, the whole thing is crumbling. The IRA rule in the Catholic estates. There is no law. They're in the process of alienating the Unionists totally. The whole thing has imploded, but it's kept afloat on vanity.
What do you do? What do you do with an organization which you couldn't deal with in the last 30 years? If you say that the ceasefire is over, the whole process goes down the drain. And then how do you try to bring peace there?
I think only a few days from Senator Mitchell's own review.
Yeah, but then you have to go on trying. You can't expect an organization like IRA to just shut its guns. They will go on doing something. But if the process can be kept going on for some time, I suppose the people, by and large, will savor peace.
Despite all the evidence despite the evidence of kneecappings, of intimidation, of violence against people, you think that's worth ignoring?
Then what do you do with them? No, you can't ignore. You have to take action against that.
But you're not taking action, and you're not going to take action, because we're actually planning to run down and diminish the Ulster Constabulary. And it's agreed that the Ulster Constabulary can't police the Catholic suburbs. What is happening is that the policing and the declaration of our power here is coming from the IRA in those suburbs. So what do we do about that? I can think of one thing you could do, and I'm going to write about this. We have the Anglo-Irish Agreement. We cut Dublin in on a lot of decisions. That seems to me fine. I'm not happy about the American dimension at all. We should start thinking seriously of two things. One is the possibility of repartition, in which Catholic bits of the North go south and the Protestant bits feel more secure. And one way of starting that is actually to invite the Irish police, the Garda Síochána, to play a role in those suburbs. It's a loss of sovereignty, but it's infinitely better to lose it to a respectable, law-abiding police force than weakly to give way to the men with iron bars.
That's looking a very long way ahead, perhaps. But Mariana, would you defend Mo Mowlam's decision?
Well, yes, I think I would. A, because I don't see an alternative either, and B, I think that the IRA never said that they would be non-violent. They declared a ceasefire, and I mean, even though
what does a ceasefire mean?
One might not like it, but I always understood it that it was cross-community violence, and the violence that the crimes they committed were against the Catholic community.
Are you not saying there is an acceptable level of violence?
I'm not saying it's all right, but I guess that it goes with the definition of a ceasefire that the IRA had in mind, and I believe that probably the politicians understood that as well, that nobody likes that kind of a definition of a ceasefire. Is just a different matter.
There's a flaw in this thinking, because there was de facto a cessation of shooting, bombing and war against the mainland, which antedates the settlement by about 3 years. It effectively stopped with a little interlude about 94. The question was, what were you going to do with that? Were you going to get a veritable peace out of it, or were you going to get a continuation of the same thing with a lot of fancy words written on a bit of paper?
Now, that's why you have the RUC reform, and why this is so important.
The RUC reform isn't going to do anything except diminish the authority of the RUC itself, embitter and alienate the Protestant community, give them a massive nudge towards either rebellion or departure. I mean, it is simply an anti-Protestant move, and you can't afford to be as partisan as that.
But this just goes round in circles, because you can keep on saying one party does this, we should be doing that, have meetings, have talks, have ceasefires. Really, I mean, can you really believe there's going to be peace in Northern Ireland in the next 2 years?
Not in the next 2 years, but I think the key thing was the fact that the IRA themselves came to government via John Hume. They came to John Major via John Hume and said, we want to be off the hook. What went wrong was that we did a deal with them that left them with far more and tied them into doing less than should have been the case. And we made a great to-do about decommissioning. I'd argue decommissioning doesn't matter. If they don't make war and they don't break bones, they can bury all the arms they like in somebody's back garden. Doesn't matter.
Right. Let us move on to sport, which we touched on earlier. And of course the England cricket team, after their disastrous for them defeat by New Zealand, are now at the bottom of Wisden's league of test teams. What's gone so disastrously wrong? Let's have another gloat, Kip.
Well, I don't think anything's really gone disastrously wrong. First of all, it's very interesting to read in Wisden this year when they said that the New Zealand cricket team was the least charismatic side in world cricket. And it was an absurdity to play 4 test matches against England after the World Cup. Who would be interested in that? Well, it sort of all turned sour on them, I'm afraid. And I just think New Zealand just had a reasonable side this year, and they played pretty well. I know the New Zealand players told me, and a lot of them were quite outraged by the attitude of the English media here, because as far as most of them were concerned, there was only one team, and that was England. And I think maybe they thought that was a bit insulting to them, because the New Zealanders felt as though they played pretty well.
But what are you doing right that England is doing so wrong?
We just may have a good team at the moment. It's taken us 10 years to get here.
Cricket has slipped out of the national consciousness to a large extent, hasn't it? It's
well,
all football.
I think English cricket people feel as though they own the game, that they've got ownership, therefore they should always be in the top 2 or 3.
Not there longer.
At the moment, they're not, but they have played some pretty good games. They could have won the series at the Oval with a bit of luck. They didn't. New Zealand played very well.
No triumphalism from you then?
Well, we're humble in victory. We feel as though that we deserve to win the series. As far as English cricket goes, I think there's 2 issues. One is the county system here, and one is what's best for England. I think what's best for English cricket, it has the best 11 players. Then you're going to get people along. Today it was announced in the papers that Tony Blair's government is going to pour £60 million into English cricket over the next 5 years to get things right. It's pouring money into a hole.
Well, I read somewhere that they are searching for gentlemen to play cricket again. I think what is wrong with English cricket is that you don't have somebody like Wally Hammond or Dennis Compton, or, a hero, a person or 2 persons who are for the young an ideal to follow. And what has happened is therefore the attention and all the fans have gone to football. So there is very little desire to do well in the youngsters in cricket. And so you're not getting talent, that's all.
Is one of the problems, and when you say that there isn't a hero, that the test selection team keeps changing its mind? People go into the team, don't do terribly well, or drop immediately. There's no chance to make heroes anymore.
No, but then if you don't have talented people, and you don't have a large number of people to select from, you see, when there is competition in selection, when a person who's been selected in a team is fearful of losing the place because there is another place.
Can I say here, there's a huge amount of people to select from. I mean, there's Freddie Flintoff from up north. I mean, he's a great player. There's a lot of great players about. There's more choice of players here than in New Zealand and Australia.
Yes.
I can't comment on India or Pakistan, but I know there's a lot of players here to pick from.
Where do we start, apart from saying that New Zealanders always were the nicest people around, and that they've handled this with extraordinary grace, and they had a jolly good team. And if we sounded preoccupied with ourselves, and I promise you, most of us don't, we feel very depressed that we do as badly as we do. The faults are multifold. They're back in the schools with the slack schoolmasters who don't promote cricket as hard and take the extra time to do it. That's one thing. There's a fault at the top in that little cliques and groups of people tend to coalesce, notably Surrey men who get together to promote Surrey men, and Landers with the awful Alex Stewart wicket-keeping situation. There is a good England side waiting to come in, not of them all of them that very English, and who the hell cares, since we're being likely to be saved by Nasser Hussain. We have got to get Solanke into that side as fast as possible. I watched him on Friday, and very, very good he is. Maddie is very good. There's a string of talent which could be used. The most intelligent thing that's been said is from the Australian Tom Cox, who's making a great success of Somerset. He said, the talent is there, what is wrong is the structure. And the worst thing in the structure is too much cricket. Too many, too long matches, mix of 1 days and 4 days. We play much less in Australia. If you play less, you play better.
Exactly. That's Jamie Cox. That's the opening batsman. See, what you should have is the county championship go straight through, and I think they should cut it down to 10 teams and have a serious nail-biting competition where you're playing.
Well, we're going to have leagues. Well, that'll start. You'll have a first division. And then we'll do that.
Mariana and Vladimir, you're both allowed to look completely
He's a Russian, she's a woman.
baffled by this.
You mentioned that.
Well, woman. I mean, England's got some great woman
How many
cricketers.
good German cricket teams are there, Mariana?
None at all. I mean, we're in the same situation, but I think it's a great pity that we are missing out on this sport because, I mean, I got really hooked during the World Cup. That doesn't make that I can really yet make sense of it, but I'm trying. And I find it a very fascinating game, so I think we should
maybe
have
in 10
it.
years' time, you know, the whole thing
I would
will
like
have
to add one
reversed again.
point, that I don't think British should be that depressed. Every country goes through this kind of a dip. Look at West Indies. Where are they today? And what were they? Australia went through a bad phase. India has gone through a bad phase. Every country does. Pakistan is not doing that well today, so possibly England will come back.
Can I just make one final comment? It's not so much cricket for me. I'd like to know the answer sometime is why the English football team isn't doing so well, and there's so many football players here.
Well, here's another discussion which we won't stray into because we're going to mark a sad anniversary which is going on at the moment. 2 years ago, it was really no exaggeration to say that much of the world was in shock. Exactly 2 years ago at the death in a car crash of the Princess of Wales. Well, who would have guessed that now that iconic image really has faded so quickly? People are complaining there's no memorial to Diana. Mariana, could you have guessed 2 years ago that it would be like this now?
No, definitely not, because I mean that I wouldn't have guessed at the time that there would be such a long period, such a week where the grief culminated until that Saturday when the funeral took place. But I mean, that was completely unexpected, and I think everybody, I think the media were following the people in their grief rather than the point that has very often been made that the people were led by the media. I think it was the other way around, because nobody could expect where the cues would form next, what would happen next. I mean, I came across a sociologist, Frank Furedi, here in this country, who explained it to my mind very elegantly, because he said it was not so much the person, Diana, that everybody was grieving about, but that it was a trend in society, that there weren't very many things holding society together. Religion wasn't that important, families were breaking apart, and he said that people are therefore looking for collective experiences where they can live emotions, and that this was one occasion where this has happened. So the memory of having been there and the memory of knowing where you were when you were first told is important, but not so much really.
So one glamorous person who had an eventful emotional life seemed to crystallize all this in the nation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Although it was also a collective resentment against the monarchy at that time. That was building up about their style and their relationship with the public. And I think also that was also a major factor. It was also a sort of expression against the monarchy, apart from the fact that a dream girl of the 80s had suddenly died. But I suppose it shouldn't be surprising that people are getting over it. You get over with your own family members that life has to go on, and so it's going on. And no physical monument of our memory has been built. You've got hundreds of millions of pounds in trust, but the trustees are fighting between themselves. Now I heard that there is some 1.4 million pound charity which William and Harry will decide. But sounding a little cynical, I would like to point out one thing. If the two grown-up sons of hers have got over the fact that there was a lady who her mother said crowded the marriage and ruined her life.
You're talking about Camilla Parker Bowles.
Yeah, they are getting on famously with her and her children. Then why should you wonder that the people are getting over the loss?
Edward.
It's much better to be alive than to be dead. You get the best of the argument.
A collective feeling against the monarchy crystallised it.
No, I think Rupert Murdoch and a few other people deciding that they wanted, for their own good Australian reasons, to bash the monarchy and latching hold of her as a jack-handle very suitable for doing it. Secondly, the woman herself was a false god and has fallen. She was a character in a soap opera. She had a great gift for hatred. She hated her husband, she hated her family, and instead of, as it were, living with it set about making war on them with all the help of these newspapers. They lost their asset, and they were as much weeping for their investment as for the woman. As far as she was concerned, she was a manipulative little minx. She was her grandmother is alleged to have warned the Queen that there was an element of mental instability there, and it was an unsuitable marriage. The advice was ignored. She engaged in her life in getting maximum favourable publicity for herself, to injure for her own glory. She didn't chase ambulances, she caught them, she threw them to the ground and smothered them with kisses.
OK, that's a pretty harsh view of Diana. Kip, is it one that you can begin to share?
Well, I agree with that. No, well, I can tell you that she was patron of the Gloucester Cricket Club, and they've made about £100,000 or received that from her trust, so they're probably quite happy with what's going on. But I just see it from our point of view that she was really an icon here, and now that she's gone, people are obviously looking for someone else to take over.
Should there be a memorial? There's a lot of hurt amongst certain sections of the public that there is no memorial to her apart from her brother's estate.
Well, while the New Zealand cricket team stayed at the Royal Garden Hotel in Kensington, I used to go running each morning past the palace, and they've still got flowers there every morning. And I think for the general people, that's where they see that as their last farewells or their goodbyes to Diana. So maybe that should be the appropriate place somewhere near there.
I think we want flowers and a memorial to the England cricket team.
Oh, well, you would bring cricket into this as well. Vladimir, around the world 2 years ago, there were extraordinary signs of grief, and people even said in the middle of the Namibian desert, 24 hours after the announcement, somebody saw a little shrine. Russia must have felt the same way at the time?
Yeah, there was a tremendous reaction in Russia. I think what is happening is the main reason for that explosion of sympathy towards Diana was the fact that she was perceived as a victim at that time, the victim of the cruelty that surrounded her, the cruelty of the royal family, her husband, and so on. But now she's no longer with us, and somewhere in heaven, she's not longer a victim, but just some ideal, some icon, and she is in calm. That is why she does not need that sympathy any longer.
You think she's still an icon for many people?
Definitely. Yeah. I live near Kensington Palace, and I jog there, and I see what Jay is mentioning. The people are coming, and more now, to the gates of the palace.
We shouldn't get that sort of lunatic.
I don't agree. Vijay doesn't agree, Edward doesn't agree, but we could go on talking about this for weeks, and we can't, alas. That's it for this week. Do join us again for Dateline London in 7 days' time. Meanwhile, from all of us today, disagreeing on some things, goodbye.
Good morning. The bank holiday reputation is going down the drain after the last few have been fine. This one doesn't look too bad either. There is a bit of a fly in the ointment. There's rain for Scotland, where it of course isn't a bank holiday. But that rain will sink south into Northern Ireland and the northwest of England throughout the day. And it will probably never clear this northwestern area. Better afternoon for Scotland, probably for Northern Ireland, but it stays pretty good for the Midlands, for Wales and areas to the south. Not quite as warm as yesterday, but still up into the 70 region for the sunnier bits.
The new releases.
This is only the beginning.
The film premieres.
It's a great pairing of energies.
Which isn't that hard.
Yeah, baby, yeah!
The future of modern culture.
The only daily roundup of the day's arts and entertainment news anywhere on British television.
Oh, that's good.
0:30, 4:30, Tuesday to Saturday on BBC News 24.
Whatever your passion.
I'm going to become an Anglo-Saxon.
It's obscure, it's weird, and people don't know how to deal with it.
Whatever you're looking for.
I'll bet you don't know what you want, but you know how to get it.
Wherever you want to go.
Ah, grazie.
The Italian's coming on already?
BBC Knowledge is the channel where you can get involved.
Never flirted so openly on television before.
Have your say and interact.
I'm laughing, I didn't understand what he said.
Whatever you want out of life, BBC Knowledge.
So why don't you be nosy and take a peek?
Timor's referendum on independence from Indonesia attracts a big turnout. The UN says more than half the territory's voters have already been to the polls. But despite a UN-brokered peace agreement, violence has marred the run-up to the referendum. Welcome to BBC News, I'm Eileen Whelan. The other headlines: Kyrgyzstan calls on all people with military experience to help the fight against Islamic infiltrators as the president appeals for calm. And another teenager is reported to have been told to leave Northern Ireland by the IRA. 4 are already in hiding in London after receiving death threats. There's been an early turnout in the East Timor referendum. Within an hour of the polls opening, 50% of those registered were at the polling stations. The outcome will determine whether the territory gains independence from Indonesia. The head of the United Nations mission, Ian Martin, said people were very determined to exercise their choice, despite violence and threats from pro-Indonesian militias during the registration process. Nearly 500,000 people are eligible to vote. If the East Timorese reject autonomy and begin the move towards full independence, it will mark the beginning of the end of 4 centuries of colonisation, first by Portugal, then by Indonesia. East Timor lies at the far eastern edge of the sprawling Indonesian archipelago. It is around 1,000 kilometres from Java and nearly 500 kilometres north of Australia. Portugal ruled East Timor from the 16th century, but in early 1974, Lisbon began decolonisation, with the 2 main Timorese political parties agreeing to independence, but the parties later fell out. In December 1975, the Indonesian army invaded. The following year, Indonesia named East Timor as its 27th province. This has never been recognised by the United Nations. Since the invasion, it is estimated 200,000 people have been killed by the resulting warfare or famine. One of the worst single incidents came in 1991 when Indonesian troops fired on protesters in the capital Dili, killing 200 people. The following year, Janano Gusmao, leader of the East Timorese resistance, was captured and imprisoned. In 1996 came a heightening of international awareness of East Timor when Bishop Belo and José Ramos Horta were jointly awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. After receiving the award, both men demanded a referendum on autonomy for the region. This was ignored by President Suharto. But when he was forced from power last year, his successor as president, B.J. Habibie, agreed to a vote on autonomy or full independence from Indonesia should autonomy be rejected. Our correspondent Jonathan Head now reports from Dili on the start of the voting.
At first light, they were already on their way to the polls. The early morning quiet was broken only by the shuffling of feet and the quiet chatter of people about to decide their country's future. Even before voting had started, large crowds gathered outside the polling stations. UN security staff struggled to control the numbers entering the compound. At times, the enthusiasm to vote threatened to overwhelm them. Whole communities had come to cast their ballots. Every generation is taking part in this historic referendum. They clutched their identity documents, ready to be checked by the UN. It was a long wait in the morning sun, but no one seemed to mind. Most of the people here said they would choose independence, a pattern which is expected to be repeated across East Timor. But the head of the UN mission pleaded for tolerance from both sides.
The international community expects all concerned to accept the outcome of the popular consultation and to continue and intensify efforts for reconciliation so as to build a peaceful future for East Timor.
That may be too much to expect after the suffering of the past 24 years. But at least here at the polling stations, for a moment they seem to have escaped the long shadow of East Timor's tragic past.
This area of Dili has experienced some of the worst militia violence. The people admit to being afraid of further attacks. The fact that so many have turned up so early in the day is an enormously encouraging start for the United Nations after the difficulties of the past few weeks. Jonathan Head, BBC News, Dili, East Timor.
And Jonathan says so far on polling day there have been few signs of trouble.
Not so far, but of course the biggest concern I think is in some areas to the west of the territory where the militias have been particularly active. It may be some hours before we get an accurate assessment of what may have happened there. I think for the UN, what's of concern is not just the possibility of violence, but also the possibility that large numbers of people who've been pushed out of their homes will not be able to make it to the polling stations, or perhaps people may be blocked on the roads. And I think they will look at the turnout very closely. Early signs, of course, are encouraging here, but the total turnout towards the end of the day will tell them whether this referendum has been a success or whether the militias have succeeded in their campaign to block people from voting.
Jonathan, voting is going to continue all day, as you said. When can we expect a result?
It'll take some time. We expect one within about a week.